He got his PhD at Northwestern, working with the late Ted Bilichko and then with Campbell. And got his PhD in 2016 and then moved to Caltech for a quick postdoc. Returned to Europe briefly to TU Delft. I was there until I guess earlier this year. And was recruited back to Brown. So Miguel is really one of the bright young stars in computational mechanics, computational science. Formal training in computational mechanics, but as the data-driven modeling wave grows, Miguel really took to it and has done some really very nice work. And so we're going to see some ideas from that today, and then we've got some more. So anyway, it's a pleasure to have Miguel visit in person.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Krishna. Thank you for the invitation. It really is a pleasure. The day has been amazing, meeting students, meeting faculty, doing great work. So it's been really an honor. All right, so I hope you enjoy the talk today. I'm going to talk to you about, there will be two parts of the talk. The first part is going to be more about kind of a little overview of what we were doing and what we've done up to now. And then the second part, we dive more into the details of this newer work that we have that is not published yet, but will come out very, very soon. Okay, so the title of the talk is Cooperative Data-Driven Modeling, and that's the second part of the talk. For the first part, we'll go over a little tour about the work that we're doing in the group. And it revolves around, like we were just discussing, about machine learning and how can it help design and analysis in the context of solid mechanics. So in this short tour, we're going to be talking about four things. Okay, and the first one is going to be design under uncertainty and how we use the simple technique in Bayesian machine learning to design a new metamaterial with a property that we didn't observe before. The process, as you will see, is very similar. The data-driven process usually goes in four different stages, and it goes like this. So first, you need an idea. The artificial intelligence is not yet giving you the ideas. Maybe in a few years that could change, but you still do need an idea. And in this particular case, it was about motivated by work in aerospace for satellites. So you have to pack a satellite into a tiny little space, send it to space, and then it deploys, right? And the idea was, okay, could we adapt this design to a 3D printed material at a small scale and obtain super compressibility out of it, okay? And we wanted to do this more as a motivator for using the data-driven process for a real thing that we could measure, build, and so on and so forth. And you first have a concept, then you parameterize your concept, and you can parameterize the geometry, you can consider different materials to build the structure, and the external conditions as well. Is it in compression, in tension? Is it the temperature that is changing? Whatever it is for your problem. And then you need to sample this design space and typically do simulations to predict how it behaves, or it could be experiments or even an analytical model. But you have to have a way to basically obtain the property, the quantity of interest. And with that, from the simulations in this case, you can get a response database, right? And these simulations, they will not look all like that. Some of them, the material may break, it may fall, whatever. Some of them will be successful, some others won't be successful. But the point is that you build a response database, and from that, you can then use different machine learning models to basically find the relationship between the inputs and the outputs. And this is pretty much probably as general as you could be in terms of introducing the topic. And if you want, you can obtain a particular model, use it as a surrogate, and then do optimization on top of it. And that would be, for example, doing it in two stages. First, you build a model, and then you optimize on the model. Or you can skip the machine learning part and just do optimization. You can stop at the machine learning and don't do optimization, where you just want to have an analysis, or the model is your end goal. So you can skip and shuffle around these steps, but usually these are the four main steps that would be characterizing the data-driven process. So that's what we did. And today I'm not going to talk much about this, but that's what we did. And our point was to actually use the simulations and the data-driven process to explore the design space. This is a projection of the design space. There were 7 parameters. This is a projection over 2 of them and keeping all the others constant. But what you can do, for example, very simply, is you can classify the design space into different regions. You can regress the design space to see how the property is evolving. And you can basically also calculate the sensitivity to the parameters. And then notice that, for example, one of the inputs is not relevant for the output that you're interested in. Okay. In this case, what we found cool about this is not so much the actual methods. It's pretty simple to do nowadays. But the fact that we are doing this all in the computational world, and we got to a point where the material did not break, did not plastify, you would actually get this supercompressibility and would come back and survive. And that turned out to be a small region in the design space, the yellow region that you see there. We picked the point, and then we did the test. And we were lucky enough that actually the simulations turned out to be accurate enough, and the data-driven process, so that actually this design worked first try, right? So you are trying to kind of invert the process and really obtain something that was not there in the literature before, get 96% compressibility, but it comes back and survives, right? And you can do this many times. One part that took a lot of trouble, I actually was the one doing the 3D printing, is to actually do this at a very small scale. So this is 50 microns. And you can use 2-photon nanolithography to actually 3D print this. And once you get the crux of the 3D printer and so on, you can get it done at the small scale and show that actually this indeed survived to several cycles. For the small scale, there was some plasticity that accumulated due to the way that the structure was created. So the simulations were not exactly the same as what you really measure, but they were close enough to find out that actually it did survive and it did come back to the original shape, even though it did accumulate some plasticity. Now, what people usually don't tell you is that this process typically requires lots and lots and lots of data, okay? And especially if I go back just for a moment, if you want to characterize uncertainty, right? So the black line is the average of 5 experiments. This is the standard deviation associated to it. And this is the finite element prediction with the uncertainty bounds. If you want to do this and characterize uncertainty, that can take you, you need a lot of points often to do that. And of course, in many engineering problems, you don't have enough data to do so, right? So the simulations may be too costly, the experiments take too much time, whatever it is, and you don't generate enough data. And this was exactly the problem that a good friend of mine, Richard Norte at Delft, who is an experimentalist, he reached out to us and said, hey, you know, I have this totally different problem. It's an optomechanical sensor, where what you wanted to do is you have this really very well-controlled manufactured sensors made of a special material, silicon carbide, that actually reflects the light very well. Okay, so you shine a laser onto it, and it's so thin and pre-stressed at a very large value that actually it starts resonating with light, okay? So it's highly sensitive. But the name of the game in that literature is that you want to have what is called the quality factor being very high. Quality factor is the elastic energy that you have in the system divided by the energy that you dissipate, okay? And if you dissipate very little energy, the quality factor is very high. If you store a lot of elastic energy, the quality factor is high. So you want to do both, right? Dissipate as little as possible and store a lot of elastic energy. But there are you can actually play with the geometry as well to bring the stiffness of the material higher and with the optomechanical properties to do so. Today, I'm not going to talk too much about this. I just want to share with you that you can even have machine learning methods in the context of data-scarce regimes. So we had a budget to actually run about 200 simulations for this particular problem. The mesh is really thin and fine, and you have hundreds of thousands of finite elements. These simulations are very costly. So you can go through the exact same process, but with the difference being that you can choose your machine learning model to be, for example, Bayesian optimization, where that is suitable for a data scarce regime, because in that particular context, you're using a regression tool and an optimization tool at the same time in the algorithm. You have the two loops in the algorithm, and it works in a very simple way. If you don't know how it is, it's very simple, really. So imagine that you do a simulation or an experiment, and you measure the property. The quality factor is 10, right? And then you do another experiment, and the quality factor may be higher or lower. And then what the model does, it builds an approximation based on those 2 points, and it quantifies the uncertainty associated to those two, to that model. And based on the uncertainty, you use an acquisition function to tell you where to go. So, for example, depending on the acquisition function, you can go in this place here, because you may believe that the optimum is over there. And the idea is that you would use less data to actually get to a particular solution, all right? And then when you have a new measurement or a new simulation, you update your model, and then you have an updated measure of the uncertainty as well, and you keep going this way until you find a particular solution. And this is particularly interesting for problems not like this, but the ones that actually the measurement of the property is stochastic itself. So you don't have an exact discrete value, which is most of the cases that we consider anyway. Long story short, in this case, we used this strategy to show that we could design this spiderweb-inspired optomechanical sensor. And the thing is that this is really very easy to do, actually. You know, I don't know how familiar you are with this, but this is actually pretty simple to do. But in this literature, you know, if you're an experimentalist and you're not familiar with these techniques, you don't actually use this kind of algorithms. And very quickly, by just applying this in about 136 iterations, we had close to 2 billion for the quality factor. And that was a world record at the time. I think it was beaten since then, but this was the highest quality factor measured. And when we actually created this Richard's lab, the agreement was actually quite nice with the simulations anyway. And we measured even a little bit above what we were predicting in the simulation. So, and in this case, you didn't need tons of data like you usually do for machine learning. I want to go over 2 more things, and then we get into the forte of this presentation. Another thing where machine learning or deep learning can be useful is if what you want to do is actually multi-scale simulations. And at every point in your material, you may have a microstructure that is complicated. And in this case, what you have is a representative volume element of the material, and you can actually strain the representative volume element, the RVE, in all sorts of directions, and create this surrogate model with a neural network or a Gaussian process or whatever machine learning method that you're interested in, and then use the machine learning model instead of the finite element simulation as your material model at the macroscopic structure. And again, the process is the same. You have your microstructure, you have your materials, you have the external conditions, which in this case are average strains that you're applying to the RVE. Then you do the simulations, you come up with a new model and so on. First, we did it for hyperelasticity. And then what we worked on was for plasticity. And the difference here is that actually the path that you impose in the RVE matters to the final solution that you get. So you can get to a different stress state if you do a different path in your deformation. So if you do this to the material and it plastifies, and you do this to it, or if you do this first and this second, you end up in a different state. So your machine learning model has to be able to predict the history dependency. How did you actually get there? And very simply, if you're familiar with deep learning, this paper got very popular, but really it's very, very simple because you just use recurrent units, recurrent neural networks, and they track the history and they learn from the history. And you can apply this, and we showed that not only you predicted, these are new paths, unseen paths, you predicted the stress strain behavior with the history dependency, you also tracked the yield surface for the material. And this is not imposed. This is coming directly from the data, and it's really predicted. Since then, this has been validated by quite a few groups and used in actual codes afterwards. And finally, I want to talk to you about our latest work that is trying to tackle one of the issues related to learning constitutive laws. Now, again, all of these pictures and all of these results, they look good on the surface. But usually when you're doing a data-driven process and you don't have a model, a physics-based model associated to it, you have a big elephant in the room. And that is the fact that the simulations at each scale, atomistic simulations, microscopic simulations, or even macroscopic simulations, are very slow. So if they are very, very slow, you don't generate enough data, and then you don't use neural networks to learn anything from them, right? So a lot of our effort was to actually develop a method that would replace the finite element method with a reduced order model that would be able to predict the behavior for plasticity and fracture. And this is very, very tricky to find in the literature. We couldn't find any other algorithm that could do it. And it was pretty difficult for us to get there. But we tried to tackle this core challenge, and Zili and Lou had an amazing role in this. And we created this method called the self-consistent clustering analysis method, SCA. Now, if you're not familiar with the method, it would take a little while to actually walk you through it, but that's not my point today. My point today is to show you that what you can do is you can take a material, you can assume that everything is linear elastic, strain the material into 3 different paths, because linear elasticity, you can superpose the solution, and then it's independent of the boundary conditions that you're applying. Then use the linear elastic solution, cluster it, use a pattern recognition software to come up with clusters. There are basically grouping points that behave similarly to each other. And once you've clustered the domain, then you can use a micromechanical tensor called the interaction tensor. If you're familiar with micromechanics, it's just a tensor that you can compute. If you're not familiar, don't worry. It's just a metric that relates how one cluster influences the other. And once you compute these clusters, all of this using linear elastic simulation, so these are fast, then you can solve the Lippmann-Schwinger system of equations for plasticity and fracture in the second part of the problem. So you just do linear elasticity, find clusters, compute those interaction tensors, and then you solve for whatever laws that you have that include plasticity and fracture, which are the slow ones. Now, the method was fairly successful. It really worked well in 2D and 3D. And you can see here, for example, that a simulation that would have 360,000 finite elements, you can divide it into 3 clusters or just 18 clusters. There's only 18 colors in this particular thing. So 18 subdomains or more if you want. But the point is that you can do this, you can compute tensors, and then when you actually make the predictions for plasticity, pretty quickly, as you refine the number of clusters, you actually get the prediction of the plastic behavior without seeing it before, right? So these are true predictions. There's no fitting involved, unlike in the previous part. So we were very excited about this because the thing is that you can make these predictions. If they would take 7 hours in a 20 CPU cluster, you can do it in 9 seconds to 2 hours in a MATLAB code, right? Then we wrote a Python code, a little bit more, but in 1 CPU, right? So it's orders of magnitude faster, and you can build the data set then to then use machine learning in the first place. Now, the point is that, of course, you are still homogenizing this. You have fewer clusters than finite elements that you have. And as you can see, if you just have 3 clusters, this is the plastic strain, so this is plasticity. But you see that the actual solution, you have a very large value of plastic strain in particular places. But here you just have 3 subdomains, right? It kind of puts the plasticity in the right place, but it's smeared out. It's lower value. It's not as amplified as the real direct numerical simulation. If you have more clusters, of course, you converge to the solution of the finite element. But then, of course, it also starts costing you more and more in terms of compute time in the actual method. And at some point, it doesn't pay off anymore, right? You start to go up and up and up, and then you're as expensive as a direct numerical simulation. Now, I left this work. This is actually work that we did in 2016, 17. And then, I left the group and I thought that people were going to work on it, and they did. And they did all sorts of things with it, except the one that I wanted to do or that I would do, if I was in their shoes. So we let 6 years pass, nobody did it. So, okay, we did it. We tried to do what we think was a very important step in the process, which is, if you now have finite strains, if you're straining this a lot, then just like in finite elements, at some point, the discretization, the clusters that you found are no longer representative of the deformation that you get at the end of the process, right? So what do you do in finite elements? One of two things. You can remesh your solution, or you could consider Eulerian methods, where your mesh doesn't move and your field moves with it, right? We took the remeshing strategy, but in the context of unsupervised machine learning. So what we did was reclustering. So we took the simulation, and at some point we say, okay, you strained too much, your field is right here, you should refine your mesh, you should recluster your solution. So this is what you get, the clusters you get if you use 65 clusters in the beginning. This is what you get if you have 305 clusters in the very beginning of the simulation. And this is the prediction you have. This is the finite element solution. This is the prediction you have with 65 clusters. This is the prediction you get with 305 clusters, right? So one or the other. These are two independent simulations. But if you actually encode, if you implement an adaptive scheme for the method, this is where you end up with 190 clusters if you refine along the way, right? And as you can see, it refines in the region where the plastic strain is higher, right? So you end up with a lower number of clusters as compared to the one that you had 305. But we showed that actually, so the adaptive scheme is the purple line you see, that actually tracks pretty well the one that had 305 clusters from the very beginning, okay? So then, of course, there's a price to pay. Because remember, you are reclustering. So that means that you have to recompute those micromechanics tensors in the middle of the process, and you have to recluster your solution. So that's the price you pay to do the reclustering in the middle of the process, right? But we show that actually it paid off. So compared to the solution with 305 clusters, it was 1/4 the time total, the total time that you get in the end. And the accuracy, so the accuracy was 15% more or less better, and it took 51% less time to get to that particular solution, right? And this adaptivity is really helping us to actually solve more realistic problems and so on and so forth.
So Miguel, I'm missing something. So how is the clustering helping in the learning?
So there's no, so in this particular case, there's no learning. What you're doing is you recluster, right? And then like finite elements, you have to solve the system of equations for each cluster. But in this case, it's a non-local system of equations that you're solving. So these are truly predictions. You're extrapolating, if you will, in this method. So there's no, the only learning procedure is to actually do the clustering. And that depends on the strain concentration test that you see there. Yeah. So everything else is just like FEM. You're making a prediction of the field, right? So this is why it extrapolates. Good question, though. So this is the tour of the work. Are there any questions so far for this first part? We're good? Okay, just a flavor of what we're doing. Now it's something that I'm particularly excited about, and this is unpublished, so it's kind of, one of the first runs of this particular presentation. So this is a topic that I feel that might become important in the future. I hope so. We call it cooperative data-driven modeling. And I'll try to explain the problem as best I can shortly. There is a huge problem in neural networks that people are not really talking about much, I think, which is called catastrophic forgetting. So here's what it is. If you are familiar with neural networks, it's a very simple algorithm, actually. So what you do is you have nodes, and you have connections between the nodes, and you have weights. Weights are your parameters, right? You have a bunch of parameters, and then you have the output. You can predict, whatever weights you have here, given an input, you will have an output. And in this output, there will be an error you can compare with your data. Then based on the error, you can then take derivatives of that and update the weights. And that's what you do, right? It's just that. That's what neural networks are. Now, when you do this, And let's say that you as human beings also have neural networks. They're a little bit more complicated than this, but you also have them. And let's say that your goal is to learn how to swim, okay? You throw yourself into the pool, you start doing some crazy things, but hopefully you'll not drown, and then, you'll start getting better. You learn how to swim, so let's say that you adjusted the weights of your neural network. The problem now is that imagine that after swimming, you want to go and learn how to play tennis. So you immerse yourself in this experience, and it turns out that we as human beings can do it, right? You learn how to play tennis, then you can go back to the pool and you still know how to swim. Neural networks as they are right now, they cannot do this, okay? Because the way they work is you are adjusting the weights and biases of your neural network to learn how to swim. Theta is the group of all the weights and biases of the neural network. But then if you're now having a new problem and you're learning how to play tennis, you are going to adjust the weights again. And as you adjust the weights, you found a new configuration that works very well for playing tennis, but it doesn't work well for swimming. So what happened is that you went over catastrophic forgetting. You forgot what you did in the past, totally. All right? So these weights are different for different tasks. And nowadays, neural networks can be trained to do the craziest things, okay? You can pretty much learn so many things, but they tend to forget the past. Now, there's a field called continual learning or lifelong learning, which is a little bit in the beginnings, to be honest. But basically, there are three approaches to try to circumvent this issue in continual learning. One method is the regularization method, the other one is the rehearsal method, and the other one is the architectural method. We follow the architectural method. Regularization is you go to the error, to the loss, and you have a term that regularizes the loss, and you're trying to play a game of not updating too much the weights that are important for the first task and updating the weights that are not important for the first, for the second. But in the process of doing so, you actually lose a little bit of the information of the past and you're not so good in learning the second task, right? So you compromise. Rehearsal methods is a little bit like cheating. What you do is you learn how to swim, you go to the tennis court, you replay the data that you used how to swim. It's like going to the swimming pool and the tennis court and you go back and forth to see if you actually learn everything at the same time. But you're replaying all the data again. It's not very practical. And then there's architectural methods, which are less common actually, which is the route that we took. And that's the one that we're going to focus on in this particular talk. So we try to get inspiration or loose inspirations on the human brain or the biological brain. It's loose, but hear me out. In the brain, you have a bunch of neurons, 80 billion or something like that. And it's interesting to see, and you can measure this in MRIs, fMRIs, and so on, that actually there are regions of the brain allocated to different tasks. There's a part where you use for the visual cortex, for example. There's a part for language processing. It's different regions in the brain, actually. So, you use one to distinguish it's a cat, it's a dog. You use the other part to actually communicate. And this is, for example, graduate student professor. Sometimes the communication is a little bit tricky to get going from one side to the other or the other side to the other. It's the same. But you are indeed using different parts of your brain to do some of these tasks. So why not doing the same with an artificial neural network, right? And that's what we asked ourselves, and that's what we set ourselves to do. So how do we do it? Well, first, you take a neural network, you have the inputs, you have the outputs, and you have the weights and all the connections. And you say, okay, you go there, you have whatever task you want to do, and you train the neural network. You trained all the weights and biases to get it done. First, there's one thing that is very well known. You can actually prune the neural network. Pruning means just cutting the connections away. And this is very well known in the literature. You actually can take them away and still get pretty much the same performance because it's so redundant. There's so many weights in the neural network, right? You can actually cut away many connections and you still have pretty much the same performance. So that's what we do. You go there and we prune the network. We have our own pruning algorithm, but you can use other. And then what you can do is you can retrain the network if you want to have the performance really to be good. And if you want, you can do this iteratively. If you want to prune more and more and more, you can even do this many times. But the point is, you can definitely find a lot of space, empty space in the neural network. Cut away the connections. Fine, this is known. Then our approach to iterative pruning is based on a metric that we call importance scores. And it's based on the inputs that you have and the combination of all the inputs in a neuron. We characterize what's the contribution of all the connections to the total output of the neuron. And then we say, we keep 95% of the signal. We chop up 5% of the signal. So every connection that only contributes 5% to the output of that neuron, we take it away. Okay. And basically, you have different inputs and you're going different routes in your neural network. Okay. And you find more space in the network. Okay. You go through the process, you sort out the importance of the connections, and then you cut them away. And alpha is the parameter that we use. It's a hyperparameter, and say, okay, 95%, we're cutting away 5% of the signal, which corresponds to many connections, as you will see. Fine. You take the neural network, you train it, and then you prune it. And now you have the weights and biases for that particular task. Let's say how to swim. Then you save this as a mask. You save this subnetwork 1, and you have all these connections that I'm painting now red. And you have the weights, okay? And you know that this particular subnetwork works well for that particular task. So keep it. After you kept it, you are now presenting the network with a second task. And just like in your brain, you say, no, I have the full brain. So I have the full connections. You present again all the connections, including the connections that you trained for, including the red connection. But keep the red connections just fixed. Don't update them. They were trained already before. Just say that you can use them and train for the black connections, right? You do this, but in the end of the training process, you didn't update the red connections, you updated black connections, but you can prune them away. And you can prune them both, the black and the red connections. So if the red connections that were fixed are useful for your task, keep them. If they are not useful for your task, just toss them away, right? And then work with the connections that you have left to train them to this new task, okay? And then you can do this as much as you'd like up to a particular limit that I'm going to talk to you about. For example, in the second task, you could say, okay, now I have the magenta connections are the red and blue. So they are connections that are used both for task 1 and task 2. And the blue are just used for task 2. You save this subnetwork and you say, okay, this is subnetwork for task number 2, playing tennis. And if you go for a third, you can do the same thing. You can still present all the connections and prune away the ones that are not important and keep the ones that are in the process. And you may end up with connections that are shared across many subnetworks or connections that are not shared at all. It depends on the task that you have at hand, right?
So in the limit, so I'll make 2 comments. One is that this is a big space to play in, because even with a small number of nodes, neurons, the number of graphs that you can define on even a small number of neurons is combinatorially large.
Exactly.
It explodes. So so there's a lot of room to play.
Exactly.
But then in the limit, you could always say that I keep the whole thing, and I just, for every task, I have a new set of weights.
That's true. That's true. So basically, you could even have just separate networks for the different tasks, right? Exactly. What is the hope? The hope is that by actually keeping the connections, you share part of the knowledge that was used in task 1 for task 2 and use less data to actually learn for it. That's the entire point of this. And it may work or it may not work, and we'll see in a moment.
Yeah, can I just ask you very explicitly, so if you train and you have the red weights, how are those used when you're training for the blue one?
They are kept fixed, but you can route your inputs through them anyway.
Okay.
Right? And you can take them away if they're not useful or keep them, but you don't update those weights, right? Because the entire point is that you want to go back, and if you're presented with the first task, you select the right subnetwork and you still have full capacity to do that particular task.
So that suggests some version of warm start for the new task.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So you do something like warm starting for
you can definitely do it. Yeah. All right. So you can do this, for as many tasks as you'd like, up to the point that you still have some black connections, right? At some point, you're going to exhaust your brain. And frankly, this is a very simple model. It's a simple analogy to probably what happens to the human brain. As you get older, you're accumulating more and more knowledge, and your brain is less flexible about learning a new language, for example, when you're 50 or something like that. That's probably mildly related to a mechanism like this. I'm sure there's like 100 more associated to them. Anyway, you can do this and you can keep going. What's the point of this? Well, you have these different tasks, and now there's two things that you can do. And that's what I want. I don't want to skip this because this is a big limitation about what we're doing. If you know the task a priori, meaning if you can tell the network you are now going to play tennis, this is trivial. You just pick the subnetwork that was used to train tennis, no problem. But if you want to learn from context that you are playing tennis, meaning you present the data to it and you have to route it to the right subnetwork, then you have to have an algorithm to select the right subnetwork, right? And that's what we do. And in fact, we were not very creative there. We used a strategy from another paper to select the particular subnetworks that is called the max output strategy. And this is, frankly, I'm not super happy with this particular part of the algorithm, but I still, want to share it with you. Max output is as simple as you could think about it. Max output means, you route the signal through all the subnetworks you have, and based on the prediction of each subnetwork, when it's very clear actually, in 90% of the cases, when it's the wrong subnetwork, you cannot even distinguish from the output what's the right prediction. But when it's the right subnetwork, there will be an output neuron that will say, hey, this is the right task. So just by comparing the maximum output of the neurons, it's frankly surprising how well it works. You can actually select the right subnetwork. What's the catch? The human brain doesn't do this, right? You don't go through all the tasks that you learn throughout your lifetime to select the right place in the brain to go. So this is kind of a dumb brute force way of going about it. But this was the first.
So building on that question, how is this different from having different networks for different tasks?
Right.
But where essentially you do like a transfer learning based on what you learned in the previous and then use those weights. So
Exactly.
Effectively, if the tasks are similar, you would still use less data.
Right, exactly. So this is different from transfer learning in just one scenario, in one case. In transfer learning, what you do is you have a model and you train for it. And now you take this model and you can do many different ways of doing transfer learning. But one of them, the simplest one, is you adapt the model to a new problem, right? You can chop some of the last layers, for example, replace by new weights and train for it. But in the process of doing so, you lost the ability to predict the previous task. Of course, you could go to the previous network and that would be fine if you keep the two models. But now think about doing this many times, right? As you do this many times, you are only able to transfer, one time, let's say, and you lose the knowledge from the previous one. The hope is that in this case, you accumulate more and more knowledge and you start finding patterns and using knowledge from different tasks to do a particular thing. That's one. And the second is that we're going to show it. This is actually more efficient. You need fewer neurons, you don't forget, and you can do all the tasks with the same model, right? But it's a good question, yeah? So, but I always want to point out the limitations, and we are going to go over it. I just want to go over this again. So the training stage is basically, you train, you prune, you save the mask, you move forward, and you can keep connections from the past tasks. The test stage, you have to select the subnetwork if you don't know it from context. In mechanics, we often do, so we have it easy. If you have a material model, I'll show it in a moment, give me a second. So anyway, what's the main result? The main result is that we use this on computer science data sets first, because it was an algorithm that we proposed. This was the state of the art for ImageNet, which is a huge data set with 1,000 classes and so on. And what we're doing is consider 100 classes, learn for it, and you get 90-something% accuracy. Then you give it 100 more new classes, and you want to predict those new classes, but you don't want to forget the previous ones. And the state-of-the-art algorithms, and there's several of them, even though this is in the beginning, in 2 or 3 years, there were like 10 new algorithms. you start losing a little bit because you're predicting the new 100 classes, but you forgot part of the 100 past classes. And you keep going, and in the end, the best algorithm ended up at a 73% accuracy, top 5 accuracy. Our algorithm didn't lose anything. We kept always with 90-something% top 5 accuracy because of the way that we constructed. What's the catch? Again, the catch is, and I show this in the paper, but I don't have it here, I'm sorry. We saturate the network at the task number 12 or something. So we went over all possible connections by then. So then whether you grow the network more, or you have to start with a network that is big in the first place. So
how big are your networks?
This I don't know how many neurons, about I think 200 neurons, 200, 100, and then the output layer. So it's not that big. So for the MNIST problems, we used the LeCun network. For this one, I think it was VGG, which is bigger, and there's a convolutional layer as well. Yeah. Anyway, so this was computer science. You probably don't care too much about this. But what happens for us as mechanicians? Well, let's say that you're in your lab doing a material model for a particular material. You do some tests and so on, and you have your own material model for the neural network. You put it on GitHub, right? And that's it. And now, in my lab at Brown, I have a material that is different. The physics is different and so on, but maybe it's similar. Maybe it's still a polymer, right? Or maybe it's a polymer composite. There's something that is common with it, but there's other things that are not. Then I could take your model, just like transfer learning people would do. But instead of losing the ability to predict your model, I could just train on top of it, keep the mask, make sure that I have just build on top of it, right? And then I'm calling this cooperative data-driven modeling because I am not disrupting what you are doing in your lab. I'm just trying to add on top of it, and I'm still capable of predicting what you did before. That's the difference, right? And you can do this for more labs up to the saturation of the network. And this is what we're calling cooperative data-driven modeling. And then what we did, came up with a very, very simple example, really. 4 different representative volume elements that you see here, right? Different microstructures. And the idea is the same. You strain it in all sorts of directions. This is with plasticity, by the way. So recurrent neural network architecture that we're using. You strain it and you have your material model. And then you go for a different microstructure and you strain it and you get the different model as well. So if you were to train 4 different separate neural networks, this is the number of deformation paths you apply. If you have 100 deformation paths, you would get 8% or 5% accuracy, error. As you move along and you have more training paths, of course, more data, you lower the error, right? So the separate 4 networks, some of them will be better than others, right? Probably task D, the microstructure is more complicated, so it's harder for the network to predict for it. This is still a pretty simple problem, by the way. The networks learn this pretty well. You see that it's not that many training paths anyway. So then what we did was, okay, let's compare this. So the standard training means that this is the separate neural network that you have, all right? Now, if you use 800 training paths for task A, and then you use our algorithm, which is, we called it continual prune and select, and we basically prune. I just want to show you that, as you learn for task B with the same number of training paths, you get pretty much the same accuracy, right? And sometimes because we prune the network, we may get a little bit of loss of accuracy, all right? So there's no continual learning in this case, right? I'm just saying I'm learning with the same amount of data with the 2 algorithms just to get a baseline, all right? And in our case, because we prune the network, we have fewer parameters, right? So we can predict the same, but it's pretty much the same. Most of the times there's almost no loss, really. But then as you start using less data, right? Now you're learning with a new network only with 400 paths. So basically you go from here to there. Now, of course, your error goes up. You don't have anything to learn from. You're learning individually. But here, of course, what you see is that the network, the cooperative model, the error almost did not grow. And you're using half the number of training paths. And as you move along, the same thing. The error grows a little bit, right? You're now using just 200 paths, but still the error is lower than what you get there. And if you just use 100 training paths, then the difference is much, much bigger, right? So this is what this is a very simple example, but it's trying to just explain or show in a simple case that keeping those connections that you're sharing transfers the knowledge, even for a case that may not be, the physics may not be the same, right? In this case, simple problem, the microstructure was the only difference. But I have the impression that this may be applicable for cases where the knowledge is even different, but there's some commonality on it, right? And we were very excited about this because we didn't play with this, okay? There's no playing with the hyperparameters. This was first shot, right? Same hyperparameters, this was the very first result. And I want to publish the very first result and say it. So just make sure that this was not a lucky shot. We were not fiddling around with the parameters. This was really very important for us. All right. Now, one thing that you may tell me is, well, but maybe you started learning with the simple case. If you shift the order around, maybe you would not learn it properly. That is not the case. We started learning with task A and then B, C, and D, and then we shuffle them around and so on. And of course, the number of parameters that were required in the pruning strategy changed a little bit, but the accuracy that we got was pretty much very, very robust across the different orders. And what you're seeing here is these are the shared connections, okay? So of course, if you have one task, there's no cooperative learning. If you have two tasks, you see that these are the connections that are fixed, they're shared. And only this percentage of connections are actually being added up. So this makes it very efficient because you are keeping only a few new connections because the graphs, the possibility is enormous. And you find out just enough that will learn the new task and keep the essence of the previous task intact. And finally, I just want to conclude by saying, note that still the total number of parameters obviously is growing. And at some point, we're already at 80%, 85 or whatever here, right? So at some point, this is going to saturate and I will not have free parameters anymore to continue with this. But there are methods, regularization-based methods, to still update the weights that are shared. We didn't do it because we wanted to keep stage-by-stage development in the algorithm. All right, so I am 3 minutes late, sorry about that, but still, I just want to conclude the talk by saying our past work, we tried to introduce the data-driven process. It existed in computer science, of course, but we tried to transport it to the mechanics community. And we're trying to solve real problems that would be validated experimentally. Optomechanical device for quantum computers, a supercompressible metamaterial for the mechanics literature, and we're solving different problems nowadays with experimental colleagues. We talked about the use of recurrent neural networks for history-dependent problems. And you know, it's really not that big of a deal. It works quite well. It was validated by other people too. And the crown jewel of our method development, which is still the self-consistent clustering analysis, which is really a physics-informed method. There's a lot of hype about physics-informed. We didn't coin the term, but this is, you know, a prediction. It's an extrapolation. It's just like the finite element method. That's our take on physics-informed, if you will. And our recent work now is trying to push for, we all start to know how to do this, but we're not talking to each other. We are not developing things together. Everyone is at their own little lab doing their own little things. We might start thinking about sharing a little bit more, put it out there, work together, and maybe use less data to accomplish a little bit more together as a community. And this is just a very simple first step. There's a bunch of things to get better at, but it's a first step, I think, in fomenting this cooperation. And with that, I would like to thank the sponsors of this work, and please ask questions.
Sorry.
I have a question where you said you were running a constituent model and now it's included in finite element codes. Maybe it's more of a practical question, but theoretical as well. So you give them this model and what do the people say? Okay, we'll put it in, or do you have to say it's only valid in this regime of the state? Here's the data. If your data looks similar, it's there. Do you provide any sort of guarantee, or you just say, good luck?
That's a great question. Right now, we're saying good luck. Yeah, and that's a great question. Yeah, because indeed, these models, that's the thing about neural networks and machine learning in general. Right? They're very, very good interpolatory tools. They're very bad extrapolatory tools. So yeah, we do provide the bounds in which it was trained, and there it works quite well, as long as you have enough data. You step away from those bounds, good luck.
Okay. And so, sorry, follow up. If they're developers of these code, how do they use this? Do they have a check in their code to see if you're within the bounds, or are they going to forget about this?
Yeah. So, okay, two steps here. What is the good news and what is the bad news? The good news is that if you're using, imagine Ellen Arruda-Boyce model, right, or the hyperelastic constitutive law for rubbers, right? It's a model, and that model is used for many different kinds of rubbers, right? And you know that if you're fitting that model for that particular material, there's also a regime where it works, right? But that's what you want in application anyway. If you have a model for that material and that works, you're good. That's the good part of the news. That's why I actually started with constitutive modeling in the first place. It's well-defined, your bounds are well-defined, you're good to go. Now, with machine learning, you can actually train classes of material models, right? So you can have a more general Arruda-Boyce model, if you will, for more material classes, as long as you are covering them in your data, right? So it's not too bad to say, look, we trained it for this is the materials that it works. If you use it for them, you're good to go. The accuracy is pretty good. The inference time is a bit, takes a little bit longer, but if you use it for plasticity, it's much faster because you don't have iterations. So it works for the purpose of what people want to do with it. If you're pushing it for new materials that were not trained for them in the first place, you're extrapolating, and good luck, right? So, but in practice, actually, you want a material model for a particular thing that you already use. And in that case, it's okay. Make sense?
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. But having bounds and guarantees and so on, that would be great. UQ, right? So you could say, no. Actually, you can push this a little further and you can still confidently go for it. That'll be awesome.
So when we look at, let's say, the swimming versus tennis example, right? And is the data that you're getting for both of them, can that from just looking at the input state of that data, can you like put them into buckets of whether it is swimming or tennis? Or so essentially what I'm asking is like, the D of swimming intersection D of tennis, is that an empty set or an overlap on that?
Okay, so there might be two things there. So if you're saying, what if my new task has different inputs, right? For example, you can do a task based on images and you can do a task based on sound. Those inputs are just not the same ones. So what we did, actually, we have in the supporting information of the paper, we have something like that. Then you need two heads in your neural network, right? And that's not as elegant because now you have inputs that are not even the same. And it's even questionable. Does it really intersect inside the network and can you gain something out of it? I'm sure that in some cases, yes, and in some other cases, no. And in those cases, just use transfer learning or separate networks and you're done. No need for it. This should be used really in the context of, do you believe that using that model will help you, right? Is there some common feature? Because if it doesn't, might as well not use it, right? Does this touch upon what you were saying? So yeah, so if they do intersect, that's more obvious that this is useful. If they don't, well, maybe it will be problem dependent, right? We don't know enough. We don't know enough about it yet. We haven't tested it in that kind of scenarios. It's a good question. Yeah.
I have another question if there's time. So the idea of fixing the weights and then training the neural network, that's the meaning, right? So if you take a network which is deeper, then you're composing more on these nonlinear functions, right?
Mm-hmm.
So does like the benefit of this approach, does it get lost
when you have a deeper network or?
Oh, that's an interesting one. Yeah, actually, it's cool. Let me see. The short answer is, as far as we can tell, so take it with a grain of salt, but as far as we can tell, no problem. Maybe the closest, in the paper, yeah, this is not going to be very helpful. In the paper, we have a graph and we colored the connections and we try to actually see where were the connections being pruned and which ones were being used. And it depends on the problem. Sometimes are the first connections, sometimes it's later in the process. But by construction, the fact that it's a deep network is actually probably helpful most of the cases, right? Because you can prune them anywhere in the process. And it's really the algorithm that decides, you know, should I prune here or should I prune there? We don't know that a priori. I think that's part of the power of this kind of strategy. It adapts to the problem that you're solving for. Of course, there are hyperparameters and assumptions. We tend to kind of regularize the network, if you will. Our importance scores are actually averaging the effect. So they distribute the signal over the different networks. Now you're good, 4 minutes. Yeah, but then if it was a different metric, maybe we would putting particular regions more important than others. So it really depends on what you're doing in the pruning step. I think we need to probably wrap it up here. Any more last minute question? Over dinner.
Just something to think about. So it suggests that the network, this works partly because there's a certain similarity in the tasks.
Yes.
And so it suggests that the network is sort of learning a higher order task. It's sort of learning mechanics, right? So I would
Ideally.
I would put it. It is learning.
Ideally.
So we should talk offline. But how does one get at that, right? How do
Yeah.
one understand what it is learning?
That
and
would be
seeing?
awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah. If it comes to that, yeah. Thanks a lot, guys.
Thank you.